La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 17, Unmasking Imperialism, Exposing Imperialist Propaganda in Mainstream Media. Today, the war against the Islamic Republic of Iran, in solidarity with our sisters and brothers in Iran who are on the front lines of the struggle against Western imperialism, the great Satan, the United States, and the empire in the Islamic Republic of Iran. And we're going to be talking about coverage of the June 2021 presidential election in Iran, as well as the recent seizure of Iranian and other Middle Eastern news sites by the US government. And joining me today is a good brother of mine, somebody I have a lot of respect for, who has some really great content on Iran and global imperialism, Mohsin Abbas, independent TV journalist, broadcaster, and current affairs analyst based in the UK. How's it going, Mohsin?
Your show, and looking forward to an interesting discussion.
Cool, man. It's really great to speak with you and hear from you. You're somebody who I've been following for a while. I've seen your commentary and segments on Press TV. I'm also a Press TV contributor myself for several years now. And it's good and refreshing to hear from somebody in the UK. I'm based in the US in Los Angeles, who is principled enough to defend the Islamic Republic of Iran against imperialism, against capitalism. It's probably one of the few countries and outlets that allows for Western dissident voices to speak on their network, in a major TV network. And recently there has been a big crackdown and media blitz against Iran. And unfortunately within the left, I consider myself on the left, but I'm really disappointed to see a lot of the lack of solidarity with Iran, the lack of attention for the sanctions, the horrible attacks that are going on by the Western imperialists, seizing the assets of Iran, Iran's government, of its media apparatus, allowing people to speak out. And so one thing before we get into these two topics, I also want to talk about the election of President Ebrahim Raisi, who recently won in the election on June 18th. Before we get to that, I just want to maybe start off by asking you, how did you get involved with learning about Iran and becoming someone who's in solidarity with the Islamic Revolution?
Well, my background is as a journalist, and I started off at the BBC, not trained directly by them, but certainly went into the business very early on of looking at, if you like, world news from arguably a Western perspective. And of course, I think what influences us is often our own personal upbringing, our background, our own sense of morality and justice, and also our experiences of what goes on around us in society, and add to that, of course, then a professional reading and analysis of geopolitics and global affairs. All of this mixes up to, I guess, make us who we are. And I think over time, it was quite clear as a journalist that quite often it wasn't the case that the honesty of the media in terms of its pretensions, especially here in the West, that it wants to get to the truth or have balanced reporting. The BBC itself, of course, was very loud with its noises about its public, its charter, which basically outlines public service broadcasting and its commitment to fairness and whatnot. But I think we can all safely agree that over the last couple of decades, for sure, there's been an exposure of the lies around that kind of sense of trying to be a kind of a voice of balance or justice. And as a journalist, not only did I sort of experience that within these institutions that I was working for, but also then doing independent study, reading, interaction, and travel to the Islamic Republic of Iran and the region as a whole, of course, unveils a lot of truths. And as time's gone on, we've seen the control, and it's not like outlets like the BBC and whatnot aren't controlled by a deep state across Western Europe. Increasingly, most media now has either a state or corporate funding background and an answerability. So when you have corporate actors, transnational corporate actors who are linked to the money mafia and such like money lender outfits, and of course then hand in hand with the other lever of power, which is the political machinery. Of course, this warps all of the media output, and then you have to obviously read much more widely. Naturally, in order to get to the truth, you have to go onto the scene of the crimes as well. And these are things, as a journalist, which would have been taken as standard. The fact is that mainstream media, by and large, now acts more like a propaganda, machinery for those who are in charge of the global banks, the global, if you like, machinery of running the world, if you like.
That's such a great point, and I'm glad you have that perspective coming from mainstream media. I myself used to work in media, some corporate media as well in New York. I wrote for a few newspapers. I wrote for the New York Daily News and a few other outlets. And that's exactly right, man. I mean, a lot of the mainstream corporate media, they view themselves as having zero bias. It's just the hypocrisy is astounding, because when we're talking about companies like CBS, NBC, MSNBC, CNN, all these US mainstream media companies, they all claim they're objective and unbiased. They have zero influences that are affecting their coverage. Yet we know that all these multinational gas, weapons, industrial complex organizations are not only funding them, but also censoring and controlling their line. But then if Iranians want to put out their own media, that's biased, that's not objective, that's filled of emotion. And it comes to this kind of racist imperialist notion that Western elites are neutral and rational, and anyone from the global South that has their own media, they're filled with rage, they're subjective, they're not rational. And I'm so glad you offer that perspective. And it's cool to see that now you're doing your own stuff. I've seen you on Press TV and other sites, and your analysis is really great. Before we get into talking about some of the latest news with Iran, why don't you give us a breakdown for people who are unfamiliar with Iran? Why don't you give us a quick crash course of history about Iran's Islamic Revolution starting from 1979, maybe if you wanted to as well, go into the 1953 coup against Mossadegh and the rise of the Shah. But give us a historical context, because I think that's something that in a lot of coverage about Iran and West relations is always left out, the fact that Iran has been affected by imperialism. So give us a breakdown of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as with most West Asian or South Asian nations, particularly colonialism plays a big part. And The British, of course, had a huge footprint in Iran. The Russians themselves played the great game, if you like, in that region. And I think the impact of those imperialistic machinations and the results of that have really created the modern day Iranian psyche to a great extent. Now, nobody talks about the genocides that happened in this period. For instance, British imperialism presided over a famine in Iran, which nobody knows about, in which millions of Iranians died. They did it at the simultaneously or around the same period with the Indian subcontinent. The region of Bengal had over 11 million people died due to a famine in which Churchill, actually there were two famines, but one in the 40s and one earlier than that as well. Churchill himself presided over the latter, basically deciding to divert grain to other regions of the empire, presumably the British military, etc. And as a result of depriving those regions of the granary and the storage of food and wheat, etc., it resulted in huge famines when, of course, weather didn't work in the favor of those regions. So these kinds of crimes against humanity, we talk about Adolf Hitler, and we are told to constantly look at the crimes of the Nazis, for instance, but very rarely will you look at crimes that were committed against folk in this region by British imperialism or American imperialism, for that matter. And I think Iran was definitely colored by this imperial footprint in that region. They did have a history of rebelling from a very early stage, and the ulama, the religious leaders, had a very frontline role. Sayyid Shirazi, I believe, in the early part of the 20th century, led the tobacco revolt, and that was one, if you like, sign that the Iranian people themselves had a great sense of their own national sovereignty, their independence, their pride in their own, if you like, culture, a civilization which stretches back thousands of years, long before arguably civilization in the West reached any kind of, level that might be described as that. The Iranians were very much at the forefront of producing and time again producing men of science, men of logic, of rationality, engaging in culture. If you go back and just look at the splendor of the architecture, going back to whether it's Persepolis and before that, or you come into the Islamic architectural period, you still find unmatched, unrivaled products of real culture and civilization, Isfahan being just one example, but you could go across the whole of the Islamic Republic of Iran and find evidence for that richness of culture. Coming into the 20th century, of course, we saw the British try to prop up a monarchy. Reza Shah Pahlavi's father initially, followed by his son, were both propped up by what I call Western imperialism, or Anglo-Zionist imperialism, perhaps even you could describe it as. And their purpose was to, as with the rest of West Asia, was to secure oil, secure resources, and to create the geopolitical hegemony in that region. The Iranians initially, of course, had misgivings, but the Shah was backed, presumably, by military and other means, and he did come to power. He ruled for several decades. His father and he ruled for a substantial period until 1979. During the period that he ruled, he imposed a hugely imperialistic order of his own, despotic, totalitarian, again, wealth gravitating towards a few at the top, and the people themselves neglected. And that, I think, ultimately was his major downfall. Within all of this period of, if you like, Western-backed oppression of the Iranian people, you had, again, the clerics playing a very prominent role, the foremost of which was Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, who spoke up openly and very vociferously, at the threat of his own life being taken many times. And eventually, in 1963, he was expelled, and he was finally thrown out of Iran and sent to Iraq, where Saddam Hussein, that very interesting character across the border from Iran, who actually had a wily eye on Ayatollah Khomeini while he had his sojourn in Iraq. At this time, of course, the movement in Iran continued. The movement against the monarchy, the despotism, and Western imperialism was still alive and well, and was hugely underestimated. Again, it was a very broad movement of, the Today party, the left, the middle classes, even the bazaris, the merchants themselves, the ulama, the scholars, the religious scholars. So there wasn't a small, movement against the Shah. It was building up very powerfully. It seems as though the Americans who were propping up the Shah underestimated the scale of this movement. They did quite significantly in 1974 give the Shah of Iran a slap on the wrist, because even the Shah of Iran, it seems, was beginning to get some delusions of grandeur with his link up with Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and the 1974 Lahore conference, in which the OPEC nations, the Islamic nations of the West Asia, all got together. The Shah of Iran was a prominent player in this, along with the Saudis, Shah Faisal, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and other Islamic or Muslim leaders, secular Muslim leaders, and they were pushing for a bigger piece of the pie, I think, in terms of what was coming out of their own nations. It backfired on them. Most of those chaps were either hanged, knocked off, assassinated. Khalid Islambuli and company, the Islamists knocked off Anwar Sadat. You had Gaddafi bombed by the Americans into place. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was hanged by General Zia. And this paved the way for the Americans to begin a far more boots on the ground effort to control that entire region and its resources. Prior to that, I think they played a slightly more subtle role, but it became more overt after this period. Here in the West, we saw that oil crisis led to schools being shut down. So it really practically impacted in the 1974, the winter of discontent overthrew the Labour Party here. So you can see the repercussions in the West for shutting down the oil at that time had huge consequences. It may be the reason why the Americans were, perhaps caught off guard, because perhaps their relations with the Shah of Iran and the others were not quite as strong as they had been. Either way, they seemed to let or somehow took their eye off the ball, some would say they perhaps even allowed it to happen. But there was this idea that a secular liberal emergence of governance in Iran might be an okay thing. But it was the likes of Bani Sadr and Mahdi Bazarjan, various other leaders of the opposition to the Shah of Iran, who were, I think, expected by the West to take charge of any new order after the Shah of Iran. And when Jimmy Carter didn't act really decisively, and the people of Iran acted very decisively for the overthrow of the Shah in 1979, it was quite clear that what was expected from the West was perhaps that liberals would take over the establishment of the reins of government. What actually happened was that the people chose Ayatollah Khomeini. They went for a traditional, spiritually orientated man who had put his life on the line for Iran against the Shah. And his rise to power over the next 10, 15 years, over the next 10 years, and his control of Iran over 10 years, really, I think, is so pivotal in terms of not only the geopolitics of West Asia, but arguably the global geopolitics, that we are yet to see its full impact actually manifest. What we saw was a new system of governance, a new mindset, a new set of ideas emerging from a nation which has huge intelligence and is used to, in its own right, having run empires, if you like, for good or bad in the past. They have that ability in that region to influence not just politically, but socially, culturally, linguistically, in all sorts of manners. And I think we're just seeing the natural return of a people who have a huge creative, intellectual, and spiritual contribution that could be made to the world and to that region. Ayatollah Khomeini simply became the mechanism or the front man to open the floodgates. And now what we've got is an Iran which is challenging Zio-Western neoliberalism, imperialism, neoconservatism. It's at the front line of challenging all that I think is bad within Western, if you like, doctrinal, political, social, if you like, engineering. Not that everything in the West is bad, because clearly there are hugely great people in the West. There are great thinkers. There are great humanists. There are all sorts of people who are spiritually awakened as well. But it's the establishment that I'm talking about, which has essentially been hijacked by, I think, values, moral values, ethical values, which go against Judeo-Christian traditional values. They go against Islamic traditional values. I think they go against human civilizational values. And I'll give you an example. And this is where Iran comes in as perhaps a viable or very interesting alternative within the mix of the world. That if you are going to erode the status of motherhood, if you're going to confuse people about gender realities with fluidity, if you're going to launch on an expedition to militarize feminism to undermine men, if you're going to use economic and financial mechanisms, usury mechanisms, money lending mechanisms to subjugate and enslave the world and to increase the wealth gap between the rich and the poor, if this is your ideology, if this is what, as a Western neoliberal fraternity, that political impact you want to bring, if these are some of the goodies, then is it any surprise that some parts of the world are going to say no? And they will say, absolutely not. This goes against our fitra. And this is a concept in Islam and in the Muslim world, which even Muslims, many of them, have forgotten, that there is a balance to human living, human lifestyle. There's a limit also. And there is a good nature and a bad nature. There is morality, which is based on prophetic virtue ethics, something we've lived by and has brought civilization to the West and the East over the years. And I'm talking about now, by prophets, I'm talking about great sages, even like Lao Tzu of China, or whether you went to sort of I don't know, the Buddha of of India, etc. There are so many wise, sage-like, prophetic folk who all came up with the same virtue ethics, the same values, the same, and from Iranian or Islamic point of view, we say this comes from God. It comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is part of the package that we are invested in as the vicegerents on this planet. And we have a responsibility to look after the environment, to look after human beings in a balanced way, to look after the animals, to look after everything, but with wisdom and with balance. Neoliberalism does not have that. And I'll pause there, because in this context, I think at the heart of Iran's movement, at the core of it, I'm not saying every Iranian necessarily totally believes it, there are a lot of neoliberal Iranians as well, but there is definitely a commitment at the core, whether it's Ayatollah Khamenei now, the rabbi, the leader, they are genuinely committed to rediscovering what this balance is and to rediscover human civilization on the basis of ethics and morality, which we're all familiar with, not the kind of nonsense confusion which is being unleashed by many of these money-orientated, greedy, pernicious neoliberal and other ideologies.
That's so beautifully said, Brother Mohsen. I mean, there's so much to say there. And I think that's first of all, such a great breakdown of Iranian history, going all the way thousands of years. We're talking about a civilization with thousands of years of culture, science, reason, development that many people don't even learn about in the US. Here in the United States, where I live, that's never talked about, the fact that the Iranian people have thousands of years of history. And there's so many similarities, Iran with Latin America. My family's from Central America. My family is from Honduras in Central America, which has historically been one of the most oppressed regions in the world. And there's a lot of similarities with Iran. For example, we have the 1954 coup against Mossadegh that the CIA overthrew. The prime minister installed the Shah government and this right-wing pro-imperialist government. And in 1956, 2 years later, the same tactics that were used against Mossadegh were used against President Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. and the United Fruit Company. And we had this guy named Edward Bernays, who was this Zionist billionaire who was creating this campaign using the media to create a campaign of propaganda against Arbenz, overthrew his government, imposed the United Fruit Company government, 50 years of civil war in Guatemala. And now moving forward to 1979, you have the twin revolutions of the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. I was actually just in Nicaragua a few months ago shooting a doc out there about the Sandinista revolution. And in Nicaragua, they call the Iranian revolution, the Islamic revolution, their brothers, because the same year, 1979, the Nicaraguan people and the Iranian people liberated themselves from the yoke of Western imperialism, of neoliberalism. That same system that you're talking about, based on usury, based on greed, based on dividing families, dividing working class people, working in a cubicle in some urban area to crunch numbers for bankers and billionaires around the world. And the people have rejected that system, both in Nicaragua and in Iran. And it's something that's really beautiful to see. So just kind of moving forward, I want to talk about the recent election that took place in Iran that were held on June 18, 2021. First of all, the president of Iran is elected for a 4-year term by universal adult suffrage with a minimum voting age of 18. So that's something that for a lot of people in the West, they're like, Iran's a theocracy, it's a dictatorship. No, they have elections. They are elected in 4-year terms. They have universal adult suffrage, and the minimum voting age is 18. And 234 polling places were set up in 133 countries so that Iranians could vote abroad. So that's another myth, right? That they say only Iranians in Iran can vote. No, people around the world can vote who are Iranian. So they open it up. It's not a dictatorship by any means. And 3.5 million members of the Iranian diaspora were eligible to vote. These were the 13th quadrennial presidential elections in Iran since the establishment of the Islamic Republic, as Brother Mohsen mentioned earlier. And President Ebrahim Raisi won with 72% of the vote against 3 other candidates. And he was the one who got the most support in that election compared to the other 3. And just some background on President Raisi. He served in several positions in Iran's judicial system. Deputy Chief of Justice from 2004 to 2014, Attorney General from 2014 to 2016, Chief Justice from 2019 to the present. He was also the prosecutor and deputy prosecutor of Tehran. And he's a member of the Combatant Clergy Association, which is anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist, and revolutionary in defense of the Islamic Republic of Iran. There's been tons of propaganda against him. You'll see this term a lot that I've seen over and over and over: hardliner, hardliner, hardliner. What does that mean? We have to take a pause and really analyze that. Before I get some reaction from you, Brother Mohsen, about the election, I just want to play a clip from Vice News, our favorite liberal imperialist hipster outlet that is at the forefront of modern day imperialist propaganda. This clip is called "Why Disgruntled Iranians Boycotted Their Presidential Elections." So I want to play this clip and get your reaction.
Very few voters headed to Iran's polls on Friday, an election day that came after one of the quietest campaigns in years. In the end, Ebrahim Raisi, the current head of the justice system, claimed victory. Raisi's inauguration in August will transfer the last major seat of power Iran's moderates had back to conservatives, giving a country already ruled by a supreme leader a kind of second throne. This seems to be exactly what the regime wanted. It assured Raisi's victory by banning progressive challengers from the race.
گفته میشه که بحث شایعه مهندسی انتخابات و این قطعاً یک کذبی بیش نیستش. قطعاً این چنین نیستش و انتخابات کاملاً آزاد و مردمی هستش.
In 2017, Raisi lost the presidency to the more moderate Hassan Rouhani in a landslide. But with President Rouhani's term limit up and no progressive candidates in the race, most Iranians opted to boycott the election entirely. Less than half the electorate turned out to vote, the lowest turnout in Iran's history.
اظهار نظر دارن که نمیخوان شرکت کنن تو انتخابات.
But many turn to social media to complain. Faranak Nutaghi and her partner Ali have been listening to conversations about the election on Clubhouse.
جمعیت شب تهران الان همه این تو هم فکر کنم.
Sometimes with as many as 10,000 others, including disqualified candidates and former presidents.
احمدی نژاد تو کلاب هاوس اکتیوه؟
آره.
چیزی؟
خیلی ناراحته. گفت رأی نمیدم دیگه. شب بحث رو اینه که کیا انتخاب نشدن. این که مثلا کیا میتونن جایگزین کنن، کدوم یکی از اینا رو میتونن وصل کنن به مثلا اصلاح طلبها، خیلی ناراحتن.
Natagi, like so many young Iranians, is only growing more disillusioned about where her country is headed.
یه جورایی خیلی زیادی فکر کنم ناامیدم از شرایط حاضر و فکر می‌کنم رأی دادنم یک جور موافقت با شرایطی که وجود داره و من در حال حاضر رضایت چندانی ندارم از وضعیتی که توشم. واکسن برای مثلا خانواده هامون وجود نداره، یا اینکه گرونی، تورم، سیاست خارجی که باعث میشه که اوضاع اقتصادی حسابی زیر و رو بشه.
So there we go. Our favorite media outlet, Vice News, putting out the propaganda against Iran. I just want to make three quick points before I pass over to you, Brother Mohsen, because I'm sure you have comments of your own. I mean, the first thing I notice is take a listen to the music that they play in the background. It's this really creepy, eerie music designed to get your cortisol levels up, to make you feel anxiety. And I did a stream a few episodes back about the role of background music, and that's exactly what they're doing here. Why aren't they playing a traditional Iranian music? Why aren't they playing the music of the people of Iran? It's always this creepy, scary music, as if, to get your heart pumping. And so that's one thing I noticed. So little cues like that we have to keep in mind out when we are looking at this kind of propaganda. The second thing I noticed is the fact that they completely invert, right? This is what even in Islamic writings and literature that I find really fascinating, is that like the devil and the forces of evil, they flip. They make good seem bad and bad seem good. And in this case, people who want to defend and conserve their people and their traditions against neoliberalism, against capitalism, they're portrayed as bad conservatives, and people who want to embrace neoliberalism, embrace the free market, embrace Western corrupt values, they're portrayed as the good people. So they totally invert the paradigm about what it means to be good and bad. And lastly, the third thing I want to mention is the fact that toward the end, she's mentioning all these problems like the economy and the trouble with vaccines. And it's like, it's not to say that Iran is perfect, of course, and the Iranian people are the first ones to tell you that there are problems in society, but a lot of these problems are rooted in sanctions. The Western imperialist sanctions that are imposed, the blockade on Iran, its inability to trade with other countries, that is the root cause of so many problems in Iran that a lot of people in the West fail to understand. So those are sort of the three things that I got from this video clip. But Brother Mohsen, I don't know if you have any commentary response.
Well, you're absolutely right. I agree with all of those very subtle points that you picked up, really, which mostly folk won't realize. Media is a very powerful tool. It's a major tool of propaganda. Ayatollah Khamenei has talked about soft war on Iran and the need for Iran to push back with a counter cultural sort of war of a soft nature. So it's not all about missiles and bombs and fighting and sort of asymmetric warfare of that kind. There's another war going on Iran, which has happened since the very day of the revolution, which is a huge multi-million, perhaps even multi-billion, certainly multi-billion, perhaps even trillion-dollar industry, which has revolved around bringing down the Islamic Republic of Iran, or at least castigating it in the eyes in the world at the very least. That's involved the Americans funding Iranian TV stations, most of them actually based in London, weirdly enough, whose sole job is to basically try to indoctrinate Iranians against the current government. And the purpose of that is regime change, very simply. It's something that they realized they couldn't do in the traditional way, as they tried in Cuba with the Bay of Pigs, for instance. And I enjoyed your update on the similarities between many of the Latin American nations and the way America has treated them and the way it's treating Iran, because I think that it's a very important point to say that Cuba has undergone virtually what Iran is getting for many, many decades, even prior to the Iranian Revolution. So this is rooted in something else, which is a similarity. Christian liberation theology was something which also talked about morality and ethics and about governance based on justice. And Iran very much has the same roots. So that's why I'd echo what you were saying in terms of the similarities and why there's a brotherhood between those nations which are oppressed by neoliberal Anglo-Zionist American imperialism. There is a brotherhood, whether it's Ecuador, Cuba, Bolivia, Venezuela now, very particularly, and Iran. Well, it's because they have a lot of values that are in common. So coming to the elections, you see, democracy comes in many shapes and sizes. In the West, democracy in America means a bunch of billionaires get together and decide who they're going to finance to become president. And it whittles down to 2 or 3 guys who are usually all pretty much the same and are all vying for, patronage from the same multi-billionaire elites who pretend that they back Republican and Democrat, but actually they do actually finance all sides. Adelson, who was a very prominent supporter of Israel, who died recently, is a very well-known example of somebody who backed Trump. But the fact is that Biden and company also have the same kind of patronage from these corporate zillionaire characters. All of this is not an accident. So one has to first of all look at one's own house. So American democracy is essentially a plutocracy, really. It's a kakistocracy or kleptocracy at best. You could use these kind of terms to describe it. I wouldn't describe it as a democracy because once the people have been mugged into voting for those very narrow folk the choices they have, they then have nothing to do with government. And what happens is the lobbyists and the financially most powerful lobbyists, whether it's IPAC or the gun lobby or the corporate sort of business lobbies, these are the guys who actually in the end dictate American policy. And so you could argue that the democracy in that sense in the West is laughable. I could do that to the British as well. You know, the mother of democracies is actually probably more than a little influenced by the Corporation of London in the city, the square mile, which controls probably 30 to 50% of the GDP of Britain. That's publicly accepted, probably a lot more off the record. This money mafia gets ignored in the West. And of course, we're supposed to believe that everything is perfect and we have a great democracy here. Well, fact is that we don't get more than 45% turnouts here in the West for our own elections. In fact, more people don't vote than actually vote for whoever gets elected. So we're always electing leaders who are a minority, essentially. The Islamic Republic of Iran has traditionally had around 70% plus turnout in its elections. Phenomenal levels of voting, if you like, in that nation traditionally. They've voted, again, within a system which is called Velayat-e-Faqih. It's a system which gives, if you like, the leadership certain parameters. The parameters, again, I have to bring back morality and ethics into the question, because morality in politics in the West seems to be a non-issue. Let me just give you an example. The health minister here in Britain just this week has been caught with his trousers down, as it were, while lecturing the rest of the country on, not having on social distancing, etc. But yet he's been busy doing hanky-panky with one of his close aides, also handing contracts out to such folk. It's corrupt to the core in terms of our governance here, even after the elections have happened. But yet, what do the media highlight? The media highlighted only the social distancing issue. They didn't care that this fellow was involved with a married woman. Now, fine, I'm not going to become a moral prude entirely, but I have to question a society where, in fact, both those issues aren't raised as a problem for a public figure who we're meant to trust, who's meant to have certain values that we can accept. So yet not a squeak in terms of castigating the immorality or the lies and the cheating he did in terms of his marital affair or whatever, or the alleged marital affair. So you can see there's some problem that moral politics does not exist here. In Iran, they've chosen Velayat Faqih, and they have an overall protector of the system of moral politics, Velayat Faqih, in the Rahbar, in the leader of that nation, who himself is elected by the Supreme Council, who themselves are elected as well. I mean, how much democracy do you want? Even those guys who are the custodians of the Iranian system are part of an electoral system of their own. Then, of course, the parliamentarians, they themselves are all elected. And in this election, one of the big issues that was made was that certain candidates were excluded and weren't allowed, Mr. Ahmadinejad being one of them. Others were also excluded. Well, there are criteria. There are things that are known to Iranian intelligence. There are things that are known to the establishment, which we are not privy to, and we don't know either. Those decisions are based on logic and rationality and evidence. Some other people who were excluded, quite clearly, would be people who want regime change, in fact, but they want it in a very subtle way. They call it, whether you decide to call it the Green Movement or whether you want to call it whatever you like, the fact is that there are people who would still rather Iran just joined the global money mafia's system. So let me give me an example within this. You had, of course, Raisi, who's one, who we'll talk about in just a moment. But one of his prime opposition members was Hemeti, the former head of the Iranian central bank. Now, personally, I have huge issues with the way the Iranian economy was managed by such folk as Hemeti, because what they've done is they've tried to buy into neoliberal economics. They didn't allow resistance economics to emerge in the full way that I suspect Ayatollah Khamenei would want, or perhaps even Ayatollah Raisi will want. What's happened is real democracy is taking place, and the likes of Ayatollah Khatami, who was in power for a substantial period, who was also part of this kind of liberalizing movement, and following that, Rouhani. The previous president, Rouhani, was also such a person. So for 8 years, the Islamic Republic of Iran has been running, borderline neoliberal strategies and policies, which have quite frankly failed. They failed in terms of delivering, even though they were being soft and acquiescent to Western establishment in terms of the JCPOA nuclear agreement, in terms of other economic, factors that they were being required to toe the line on, and in terms of many other aspects. So these folk arguably had 8 years to prove that they could swing Iran into what would be regarded as the mainstream of the international community by accepting neoliberal politics. Now, Iran is still not a formal member of the Bank of International Settlements. It's not under the central bank in that sense. And I think that's a great thing. But certainly this tug of war between whether Iran becomes a vassal state of neoliberal economic levers of power, and whether it allows those folk to come in and take custody of Iran's wealth, its economics, its politics, or whether it should go independently on the course that Ayatollah Khomeini set it, which means that it has an independent sovereign policy, that it opposes oppression in the region, it supports the national sovereignty of Iran, it keeps out transnational corporations from coming to take over the entire country. Well, that's what the clash has been internally with Iran. And what we've seen in the elections is yet again democracy playing its role. Ayatollah Raisi won an overwhelming landslide victory from those who voted, and Agha Hemeti, who was the neoliberal candidate, who would have been arguably nominally more pro-West deep down, got something like 3 or 4% of the vote, if that. Now, that tells you a story. We can argue about whether the elections lost certain percentage of people voting. Well, that happens. France, for instance, in 2014, from I think election turnout of something like 64%, went down to 46% within I think within their last election. In that short period of 6-7 years, they lost something like 25% of the electorate. People get fed up. They do get tired of promises. Now, the 8 years that President Rouhani delivered for Iran came on the back of all sorts of promises, which he was banking the West would support him in terms of cancelling economic sanctions, the worst economic sanctions that I can witness in living memory, at least. And he came on the ticket that he would get rid of these sanctions. He didn't manage to do that because the Americans reneged on their agreements in the JCPOA. Unsurprisingly, Trump came in and turned everything on its head and destroyed anything that Rouhani was hoping for. Now, the public that are obviously not happy, whether it's your folk like Dr. Ahmadinejad or Rouhani, who are both opposite, scale ends of the Iranian, if you like, political spectrum. If neither of them deliver absolute economic, if you like, prosperity on the scale that the people want, there's going to be a degree of resentment. And one has to then analyze why that economic, if you like, success on that level hasn't come. Well, the answer is totally in the business of economic terrorism and sanctions by the West upon Iran. It is also to do with mismanagement. It is also to do with corruption. It's also to do with those kinds of internal affairs, which Ayatollah Khamenei has pointed out to, which any governance, any nation has to deal with. Corruption in Britain happens, but it happens in a way where Boris gives his contracts to people on the quiet. It happens in America where the lobbies in the background go and hustle their deals and get those contracts for war upon war. Lockheed Martin and Boeing and all these guys who are making huge amounts of cash out of the never-ending wars that the American government launches. That's not an accident. These things are engineered, and I just think that when it comes to Iran, the exceptionalism then that the Western media characterizes in terms of all of its so-called woes and problems is obviously exaggerated in order to wind up the Iranian population. And there's been an absolutely huge campaign before these elections by Western deep state psyops to basically dissuade people from voting, to undermine democracy. So the people who love their democracy here have been financing and backing the undermining of democracy, one of the only democracies in the Middle East. And yet, at the same time, the hypocrisy of those same outlets is that they support Saudi Arabia, a despotic monarchy. They support Qatar, a despotic monarchy. They support Bahrain with multi-billions, another despotic monarchy. They support Egypt, which is just a straight dictatorship, totalitarian dictatorship. They support the dictators and the despotic monarchs. Yet the only democracy in the region is laughably derided, attacked, and actually people in Canada Iranians in Canada weren't even allowed to vote. They were prevented from voting officially by a liberal Canadian government. I mean, that just kind of tells you everything you need to know. What they all really want is Islamic Republic of Iran's resources. They wanted to come in line with the money mafia system, and they want to rape that country and to plunder it like they do every other poor nation, with the World Bank coming in, imposing its diabolical strategies and economic policies, which are going to guarantee to destroy the nation, take away its wealth, and to subjugate it to the world economic, if you like, order.
That reminds me of a quote by the late Venezuelan president Hugo Chavez: "Neoliberalism is the sure path to hell." And that's exactly what neoliberalism promises, because once a country adopts the neoliberal economic order, once they play into that, once they begin to accept and negotiate with the great Satan, they accept that viciousness, that horrible, evil nature of capitalism that subjugates your country to foreign values, foreign commodities, that completely pillages and plunders your country. And I think the Iranian people have been able to see, like you mentioned, within the past few years, that neoliberalism and trying to appease the enemy, trying to appease the great Satan is never going to bring you anywhere closer to real truth and justice. And I think the election of Raisi is an example of that, the people rejecting that sort of attempt to reconcile the Islamic revolution with neoliberalism. And I think you put it very well when you talk about how people in Iran and also in Syria as well, with the election of President Bashar al-Assad, the people defending their president and their country against Western imperialism. I think we're seeing a shift. It's interesting because I was born 1991. I was born the year of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the 90s, this was like the high point of capitalism, of Western neoliberalism, people believing that the dollar and the US was invincible. It was the end of history. And I feel like my generation and moving forward are seeing that capitalism and neoliberalism are no longer valuable. They're no longer providing value. It just extracts the resources and values of any society and empties them and vacates them. And we're seeing people around the world reject it in different forms, adjusted to their national conditions. And I want to go moving forward a little bit to the media war, the ongoing media war against Iran, because part of it is also censorship. Press TV, Press TV has been removed from YouTube. All of its accounts, many of its accounts have been censored. And I just want to play a clip from RT about the US government seizing multiple Iranian media outlets, as well as media outlets from, I believe, Yemen and other countries in the Middle East. So I just want to play this clip. Shout out to my friend Kayla, by the way, who's one of the presenters on here. But this is from RT talking about the seizure of Iranian media outlets.
The United States has blocked 36 Iranian news websites for what it calls violating US sanctions. It comes amid rising tensions between the two countries. We've reached out to the International Federation of Journalists, which criticized the move, noting it's not how disinformation should be fought.
The blocking by the USA websites run by groups affiliated with Iran is the wrong way to deal with so-called disinformation. While real journalism requires the respect of solid ethical principles and full independence from governments, we cannot accept that governments unilaterally decide which websites they don't like to shut down, thus challenging freedom of speech.
The ban on our website reveals once again the falsehood of the slogans of freedom of expression and all the other headlines promoted by the United States of America, including its inability to confront the truth.
One of the websites that was seized is run by the Houthis that is fighting against Saudi Arabia and has long been accused by the United States of being Iranian proxies. The other website that was seized is of Iranian origin, and the other website, Press TV, is Iran's official English language news outlet, the primary voice of Iran to the English-speaking world. It's important to take the context into account. Now, we have Joe Biden and his administration that have been in office since earlier this year, that have talked about reopening the Iran nuclear deal, have criticized the Trump administration's handling of U.S. relations with Iran. But we've just had an election in Iran itself, in which we have a new president who was quite critical of his predecessor, Rouhani, and his negotiations with the United States. So we have a new administration set to come into office in Iran. We have a new administration in the United States. And the context and the moment of this is quite interesting.
Okay, talking to
Mohsen, could you imagine if Iran decided to shut down CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, or in the UK, the BBC, or The Sun, or The Telegraph, or any of these major Western media outlets? Immediately, I could imagine World War III would be declared. The US would probably launch, and the UK would probably launch an invasion of Iran, claiming that there's censorship. Yet the U.S. is doing this and nothing, not a peep in mainstream media about it, no outrage. Your response to the recent media, because this affects us as well, like even us having this conversation right now could be censored, could be suppressed. So your response to the ongoing media censorship of media in defense of Iran?
Well, I think when you're at war, and the fact is that Iran has been under attack, and it has been at war with what I call Anglo-Zionist Western imperialism, you expect these things, propaganda, fake news, you expect, dirty tactics. But I think once a nation like America, which purports to be, the superpower of the world and wants to impose itself as such on the likes of China and Russia, let alone Iran, it shows to me an insecurity. And it shows to me that that America is losing on multiple fronts, both in terms of its propaganda war on Iran, but also China and Russia. It's been doing this across the board. And that, I think, shows me weakness. It shows me that they're scared. They're actually totally frightened by what is can only be described as the Eurasian axis that is emerging, an economic powerhouse, which is beginning to build the Belt Road, to beginning to create economic alternatives for West Asia in particular and other oppressed poor nations. China is at the core of that Belt Road initiative, and China is America's main, it's growing under Biden to become America's main, if you like, bête noire now. Maybe that's a good sign for Iran. Maybe it means Iran will get less hassle in the future. But I doubt it, because Iran is fundamentally part of that Belt Road initiative. It's at the heart of all of that, if you like, network. And I think it's this which is generating partly the fear that America's economic plunder and hegemony and rape and resource acquisition will go down the drain with the rise of this new, if you like, force. So that's the first thing to note. So their propaganda war and their media war against Iran is a sign of, I think, weakness and insecurity. In terms of political reasons as to why they're doing it, but all this U.S. cyber piracy, there are arguably two key factors. They're crude tactics of blocking websites. Knocking down a .com site is hardly going to stop Iran from being able to broadcast. They've gone obviously to the .ir site. It seemed a ludicrous thing to do. But perhaps, number one, you've got to remember that Israel and its informational defeat in the latest clash between the Palestinian resistance and Israel, which everybody knows is an open secret now, the Iranians were the prime players in providing military and other aid to the Palestinian resistance. In fact, they tore down the Iron Dome of Israel, the myth of the Iron Dome's defense mechanism, based on homemade missiles, technology which I know, Iran it is very capable of having trained the Palestinians to deliver. And not only that, they had such weapons as the Gaza drone, which are now capable of firing up to 13 missiles in one, if you like, flight. And on top of that, the more sophisticated ballistic missile technology of Iran, which is now being made available to the Yemeni resistance, to the resistance in Iraq, to the resistance in Palestine. These things have rattled the Americans and the Israelis in the region. It's a sign that they cannot have their own way militarily, with their boots on the ground or not. They cannot dislodge the resistance axis, and Iran is the heartbeat of the axis of resistance, and it is the power which is committed to clearing out the imperialist rape and plunder of that region. This frightens the hell out of the Americans and the general Anglo-American, if you like, axis. And so Israel has been exposed. They were defeated in terms of this media war across social media and others. And you can see that Facebook and all the other outlets which have their bases in America, or actually are trundled through Tel Aviv, actually. Most of the internet actually seems to be controlled from dear old Tel Aviv as well, it seems, not necessarily Silicon Valley, which is often a fact that people don't know. And of course, the agencies like Unit 8200 in Israel, which have a huge cyber warfare ability, and have been handed that by Americans, and themselves are developing independent abilities to, who knows, in the future they might have the ability to even unlock the codes of America's nuclear arsenal. We don't know. The fact is that there's a very dangerous world in terms of cyberspace and the media war. It goes beyond just social media messages and or shutting down .com sites. There's a massive cyber war going on. The Americans started it with Iran with the Stuxnet cyber intervention, or the Israelis certainly were involved with this. With both of them hand in hand. And since then, we've seen a never-ending trail of Israeli and American cyber warfare. The Natanz nuclear facility was attacked. Fires have been set off in all sorts of electrical power stations. We've seen perhaps the downing of the Ukrainian flight, which soon after Soleimani was brought down, which was very mysterious and rather suspicious in the sense of how on earth Iranian radars didn't pick up what was going on. There's a strong theory to say that this was part of the cyber warfare responses. So we've got this kind of silent cyber warfare going on. And as far as the media, the Biden regime's it also does need to appease Iran. Let's not forget this, because they know they can't militarily bring Iran to heel. They know that the economic terrorism has failed because Iran is still standing and is growing, in terms of scientific and technological expertise. I mentioned ballistic missiles, but that's just one part of it. They're able to send satellites into space now. They're able to do virtual robotic operations on dogs. I just seen that this week. They have robotic engineering technology, which is of the highest form, evolving. I think this all scares the Americans and the existing powers to be, because the Iranian people have invested in this kind of technology plus this moral commitment to protecting the oppressed, and of course they have huge economic resources. Iran hitherto was only relying, of course, on oil and gas. That's not the case anymore. Resistance economy and the constant economic sanctions have forced even neoliberal leaders like Rouhani to start investing, or they've been forced probably by the IRGC and Ayatollah Khamenei's weight to invest in the mining industries, the natural mineral resources Iran has, the manufacturing skills and base, the emerging generation of intellectual, youngsters that are coming out of medical schools. This is a part of the story which the American media won't highlight and want to suppress. The fact that Iran now educates more women than ever before. The fact that Iran has produced more, people, youngsters with degrees than before. The fact that Iran has an agricultural system which is being modernized, even with environmental, if you like, sustainability in mind. The fact that the Islamic Republic of Iran has all of these scientific and technological abilities combined with these resources mean that it's even in a better position than the likes of Cuba or Venezuela to become an alternative system that the world can look at and aspire to. The Chinese mechanism is ultimately, let's face it, it's going to be what I call a totalitarian capitalism of sorts, because it's a combination of capitalism with the old communist leadership. Like it or lump it, that's what it is. Iran needs to, I think, use its intellectual and economic and natural resources to show the world that it's not necessary for us to dive headlong into unethical so-called modernization without taking stock about where it leaves humanity and where it leaves our planet. They can be the forerunners in this. The Americans and their Zionist money mafia, influencers are actually petrified that this model can emerge as an alternative. And I would say that the media war is a very significant part of their effort to dissuade Iran from continuing on this path. I can't see it stopping. The fact is that now that Ayatollah Raisi is in power, it means there's going to be greater synchronization with what Rehber, the IRGC, and the government want. So what you're going to see over the next 4 years is less of a tug of war, less of a disinclination to carry on using the same old structures. I think there's got to be an infrastructural change so that the bureaucracy and any corruption that does exist gets rooted out. I think that they've got to go for a resistance economy, which is pushing the neoliberal economy's influence out even more. I think that they're going to, under Raisi, be able to map a much more, if you like, self-sufficient, path. And if he's successful, if we see the results of that, i.e., more jobs, more people, more affluence within the nation, and more self-reliance, more power to small businesses to create cottage industries and a move away. These will all bring employment. These will all bring prosperity to Iran. And I think that given its resources and given its support by China and Russia and its inclination now to look eastwards for its economic, if you like, resurgence, rather than waiting like Jawad Zarif and Agha Rouhani did to a great extent, which was to look towards the West and, be hoping that the Europeans, etc., would persuade the Americans to release these sanctions. I think that time is gone. I think the time now is for a total self-reliance. And this is what worries them about Raisi, and is why they will castigate him and why they will demonize him. They raised, for instance, with Ayatollah Raisi, his track record of being in the judiciary when certain individuals were executed. Supposedly, thousands of folk were executed. Well, first of all, revolutions usually are bloody. The Iranian one wasn't a bloody revolution. It was the counter-revolution backed and financed by the West through the likes of the MKO terrorist organizations, which they still back to today, based in Albania currently. The MKO have been terrorizing Iranian population for years, killed over 17 to 20,000 people in Iran itself. Now, it's this that actually caused the bloodshed. So what do you expect the Islamic Republic to do? If you have terrorists, if you have people who are trying to destroy democracy, trying to destroy the path that has been chosen by the Iranian people, the judiciary have laws, like they have laws in the West. According to those laws, people who are terrorists get executed. That's the law. There's capital punishment, just like in America. In America, they inject kids with various poisons to kill them. They electrocute them. Have we forgotten that actually we also have a capital punishment system? But then when judging Iran, when it does it for legitimate reasons, becomes a huge cry. And of course, the human rights organizations are all rolled out, the HRW, Amnesty International, were all incidentally part of this network of the UN, the WHO, the atomic agencies, the United Nations itself. These are all levers of power of the same money lenders which control the Fed in America, which are part of a massive bullying network which makes all nations bow to that money mafia power. Now, Iran says no to that. Rabin certainly says no to it. For the time being, we've got now a government which is going to work hand in hand to say no even more loudly, I think. And I think, from my point of view, the Iranian people, arguably, because they have democracy, are also potentially a vulnerability. Because in a democracy, if you don't understand geopolitics, if you only understand what your immediate needs are, but don't have a vision, what we call basira, for the bigger picture, you can end up voting or not voting for an individual because of your own personal individual need and due to your lack of the bigger perspective. The Iranians so far have resisted the temptation to fall for the trap of just looking at their immediate hardships and the suffering that economic sanctions has brought on the nation. And they are looking at the bigger picture. I think they stick with it. If they stick with it for another 8 years, this new economic resistance plan, I think, should reap rewards and benefits. China has invested I think something like 400 to 600 billion in infrastructure. They've pledged to do that. This augurs very well, I think, for the long-term revival of Iran without having to bow to America for economics or the dollar or bowing to the Zio-imperialist institutions.
So many great points there, brother Mohsen. I don't even know where to start. I mean, so much of what you're saying is true. And I think there's so many levels to it. There's political, spiritual, ideological. Sandra had a good point here in the chat. She said, I think she's talking about Western media. I think they were confident in their propaganda until they saw how the pro-Israel narrative fell apart in their last war on Gaza. Indeed. And Erica said, over 700 of Baltimore City surveillance cameras. City Watch is owned by an Israeli tech company. U.S. pop culture media shows like Shahs of Sunset, petty bourgeois Iranians to push the U.S. line of a deadly terrorist Iran to the U.S. masses. Show is also pro-Zionist. That's exactly right. And part of that, it's ironic because even though the Zionists run the media, they have all the money, they run the banks, they control all of the mainstream Western media, they still can't win the media narrative. The Palestinian people with zero money, zero influence, because they live a true and beautiful life that is against this empire, against the Western Zionist regime, the truth always comes out, right? The truth always manifests itself. And this narrative that Israel is somehow an underdog, that it's oppressed, because that's the narrative that they feed off of. They have to feed off of this narrative that they're the ones under attack, that they're the ones that are oppressed. But we know that the Zionists and Tel Aviv, they're the ones who are the most powerful. They're the ones who are oppressing. That narrative is revealing itself, is manifesting itself. And people, in the same way, in a biblical way, like with the snake and the apple, people around the world, we have like this metaphorical apple presented to us by the snake, which is like the Western lifestyle, McDonald's, Burger King, Western music, Western cultures, pornography, all the stuff that is imposed by the West. And countries around the world like Iran, like Syria, like Nicaragua, like Venezuela are saying, no, I'm not going to bite into the apple, and I think it's ironic too, because even the symbolism with iPhones and China, we have technology, Chinese phone technology like Huawei that is becoming more popular in Iran as opposed to the iPhone. And it's interesting that on the iPhone, I have an iPhone myself, unfortunately, you have the Apple that's bitten into. And I think people are rejecting that sort of Western technology and values for something different. And I think you're exactly right when you're saying that people are going to look more inward, build, and look to their thousands of years of history for self-sufficiency, self-reliance, look to their own values and continue to build. But Brother Mohsen, I think we're out of time, but it's been really great talking to you, man. I hope we can do this again soon. You have such a wealth of knowledge when it comes to Iran and the world. And how can people follow and support your work?
Well, currently, Press TV is my main outlet. We're in the middle of establishing a think tank. I think we're going to a lot of these research and ideas that we've developed over the period through critical thinking and other, partner organizations. It's time, I think, to perhaps just create a think tank which is truly independent and kind of has this overview. There are other really good ones, but I think my current involvement, I'm taking a little bit of a sabbatical this year. So on Facebook, you'll see me pop up. I get banned on Facebook quite regularly, as you can imagine. So I have various identities, but Said Mohsin Abbas, SM Abbas, you can find me on all sorts of ways there. I am on Twitter nominally. You can find me there as Said Mohsin Abbas as well. And but the think tank IMCD is, I think, an important one because I think we now know that the US 15 or 20 years ago, it was powerful enough to pretend that it was giving free speech and it allowed a less kind of stringent control of the media narrative. The fact is, it's no longer as powerful as that, and its decline on these multiple fronts is manifesting. And what they've done to Press TV and these outlets is so nonsensical that, honestly, if you look at the people that they were banning, just as a final point, there are stations which weren't even political. They weren't even. So this is civilizational. What they're worried about is not just the Iran, but they're worried that humanity and the human civilization generally will wake up to the lie and the cheating. So I think more people should just research independently, look more detailed at the kind of what I call the countercultural narratives, counter-political narratives of Iran, of Venezuela, of the Chinese, and only then can you get a balanced view of what's really happening. Don't rely on me. Don't believe everything I say or any one person. Go and do your research. Do your critical thinking. Don't just take the media line. That would be my advice, and then I think withdraw consent. Don't buy into these agencies. Don't pay for them. Don't pay their way. Invest in those who you ultimately decide tell the truth and really back those, and say no to these neoliberal contricts, as far as I'm concerned. But I'm glad to be with you, and anytime, always at your service.
Thank you so much. And we spoke with brother Mohsin Abbas, independent TV journalist, broadcaster, current affairs analyst based in the UK. Please go follow and support his work. Take care, man. I definitely want to talk with you again soon, and I hope you have a great week. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Take care.